Okay, we're going to get started and see whether we can pretty much get back on track. Thank you all again for being here, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Commissioner Pye. So welcome to the first panel. So this panel is it's not very poetic, but it's named the Right Regulatory Approaches for Wireline and Wireless Broadband Providers. And so we're going to delve in further and probably with even different dimensions perhaps than we did with Commissioner Pye, all in the context of our overall theme. Now, what I'm going to do, you have your brochure, hopefully, with you. The brochure has all the bios. I should point out, first of all, that Rick Witt, who was scheduled in this panel several days ago, his travel plans changed unavoidably, and so Rick Witt is not here. And you could see that Steve Davis is not here as well, and due to a family emergency. And but I'm pleased that Melissa Newman is here in Steve's place. Now, what I'm going to do is introduce our panelists just in the shorthand version of giving you their current titles, basically, and if you want to know where they went to school and so forth, then you've got their brochures. So first we've got Rebecca Arbogast, and Rebecca serves as Vice President for Global Public Policy for Comcast Corporation, and she's responsible for the development and coordination of the company's public policy efforts across the corporation. And then next, I'm just reading these in alphabetical order. It may not be the precise order I asked them to speak. Next is Daniel Lyons. Daniel is an assistant professor at Boston College Law School, and he specialized in the areas of telecommunications, administrative law, and property. And I'm proud to say he's a member of the Free State Foundation's Board of Academic Advisors. Next, we've got here Commissioner Robert M. McDowell, still Commissioner Robert M. McDowell. Commissioner, I don't know whether you were here earlier during Commissioner Pye's conversation, but as soon as he mentioned your name, the room broke out into applause. I guess it's going to happen today a couple times, and I'm going to say something about you in just a minute, too. Now, so then we have Melissa Newman, as I mentioned, and Melissa is Senior Vice President, Federal Policy and Regulatory Affairs for CenturyLink, and Melissa is responsible for developing and implementing, coordinating the company's advocacy at the FCC, as well as other federal regulatory agencies and with the administration. And then finally, we have Robert Quinn. Bob is Senior Vice President, Federal Regulatory and Chief Privacy Officer for AT&T, leading AT&T's Federal Regulatory Group, which is responsible for all matters affecting AT&T and its affiliates before the FCC. So you can see we have here, and I'm very pleased about that, we've got the people in the industry that seem to be responsible for all the things that we care about here, at least in terms of advocating positions here in D.C. and even around the world. Now, just the ground rules. We're going to. I said I was going to give each panelist up to 4 or 5 minutes to make an initial statement. I'm going to hold them to that. We're time constrained. That includes Commissioner McDowell, the fact that he's soon to be ex-Commissioner McDowell it makes it even easier for me to hold him to that. So just try me. But after we go through those initial statements, then I have some questions. Hopefully you'll think of some questions as well, and we're going to have the panelists interact with each other and mix it up a bit. Now, Commissioner McDowell, I'm going to have him go first. He asked whether he could, and you know, I just want to say this. I had it somewhere, and I always put these things around and they get mixed up, but I do want to say this about Rob, and I said it yesterday in a statement I issued, and it basically went like this, that my first and my last reaction when I heard the news was that this was a real loss for the commission, and I said that he had always been very thoughtful and principled and even scholarly in his approach to his work at the commission. I said those are obviously attributes that are to be admired in any commissioner, and of course there are others that, you know, that share those as well, but Rob's especially demonstrated them. But then I went on to say, aside from that, with his free market oriented perspective and his pro First Amendment friendly perspective, which is especially important for me, that was really just icing on the cake. So so we can give him one more round of applause, and I thank you, Commissioner McDowell. All right, you got about 4 minutes to start us off, sir.
Thank you, Randy. And in terms of punctuality, thank you for leading by example.
How soon did you say you were leaving the commission?
No, but thank you for your very kind words. And I'm wearing a Duke tie today. It's not just March Madness, but you're here. Michelle's here. I'm going to go see David Rubenstein here in a minute at the Economic Club. And then I'm coming back, by the way, for the luncheon, so I got to run and come back. But first of all, thank you all very, very much. I've actually, something I really didn't expect. I've been overwhelmed by the response of my departure. I guess I could cut both ways. But I've literally got hundreds of emails in my inbox and voicemails, so I will try to get back to each one of them, but thank you all very, very much. I see Michelle, and I see several faces of people who've sent me things. So it is, a lot of people have said congratulations, and it's hard to leave a dream job, but believing in the principles of limited government, I think it's important to move on. And we should not have a permanent governing class. So that, and I also have 3 very expensive children who are getting more expensive by the day. But so there's an economic, at least back into my natural habitat, the private sector at some point. I have no idea what I'm doing next, but thank you all very, very much for all of your kindness. It's been wonderful working with everybody. I see the press table that includes you. I'm the product of 2 journalists, as you all know, and I respect what you do and respect your freedom as well. But everyone here, for your great thoughts, even when we disagree, I appreciate all your thoughtfulness. Like I said yesterday at the open meeting, to quote Monty Python, I'm not dead yet, so I'm still around for a few weeks at least. Substantively, I'll try to wrap this up. I hope we talk about a couple things. Incentive auctions, where that might go, the pitfalls in front of the commission as it tries to implement that. And I'm sad I won't be around for that, but it doesn't look like I will be. And then also, what happens should the D.C. Circuit, well, first of all, ever hear an oral argument in the open internet case, but that vis-a-vis Title II and also vis-a-vis the the concern and the likelihood that the ITU will continue to expand its reach into regulation of the internet and how that's all related. So thank you very much, Randy.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, I think I'll just turn to Rebecca first for her opening remarks, or next. You have to push that.
There, thank you. Thank you and congratulations on a good run. Thank you. The pioneering computer scientist Alan Kay famously said that the best way to predict the future is to create it and invent it. So at one level, policymaking is about predicting the future, which none of us are very good at, but as Kay notes, we create our future as well. So I'm going to outline just 3 things about broadband that I think policymakers should keep in mind as they're creating our better future as we transition to the IP world, and then one big thing that we do not know. First, we know that the U.S. is a global leader in the Internet. There's been hand-wringing over the alleged failing and falling state of U.S. broadband, but most of this has been based on misunderstood and misused statistics, and that's not the way to create policies that will create a better future. So the U.S. is a leader in broadband speed. We hear claims that it ranks low in broadband speeds internationally, but it's a comparison that's designed to confuse because it compares average speeds in the U.S., which is a huge country with a varied population density, with countries like Korea, which we're 7% of their population density. So comparisons that ignore those differences are silly at best. The U.S. also has the second most affordable entry-level broadband among OECD countries, which is important because it helps bring people online, which is key. And the absolute prices of broadband have remained essentially flat over the past decade. Well, at least for cable, the speeds have increased by 900%. So that positive trend in broadband stands in sharp comparison to trends in other key services like education and health that determine a person's and a country's future. So while the cost of broadband has remained flat, the average annual cost of college, a factor I'm newly quite familiar with, increased by 72% over the last decade, and private health insurance costs increased by 114% over that same period. Those are real problems. Broadband isn't. The U.S. is also a leader in how we use broadband. It's important to remember that it's not an end in itself. It's what we do with broadband and the Internet that counts. Several independent organizations rank the U.S. at the top in qualitative measures of the Internet's impact on economic, political, and social life. And we'll continue to move forward if we take on the challenge that my former colleague Blair Levin set for us in the National Broadband Plan, which is to leverage broadband, leverage the Internet to promote advances in health, education, and national security. We're also a leader, and this goes to some of the comments that you were making, Randy, with Commissioner Pai, in competition in infrastructure. So we have actually the 3rd highest population served by different Internet networks. Resale-based competition that's achieved by mandated network unbundling led to somewhat initial lower prices in retail prices in Europe and elsewhere, but it also discouraged investments in the networks. And now we hear Neelie Kroes, who's the U.S. leader on broadband policy, has charged the EU with turning around their policies so that their networks can catch up with ours. And I want to make just one last point on this issue. We hear so often that the U.S. is 22nd in broadband, that in some circles that's become an accepted truth. But it's not true. It doesn't even rise to the level of truthiness in the Colbertian sense. The number, near as we can tell, comes from a 3rd quarter 2009 Akamai report on speed, which of course doesn't reflect the advances that have taken place in the last 3.5 years. So that kind of disinformation isn't a good foundation for policy analysis. Are we first in every measure of broadband and Internet performance? No, but we're strong across all measures, and our broadband standing exceeds our performance in a lot of other key comparative measures. On infant mortality, we're number 48th. We rank 22nd out of 27 developed countries in our high school graduation rank. And the plain truth is that the U.S. model has delivered for us world-class broadband and has powered the U.S. economy to be the home of much innovation for many companies and many people across the world. Second, we know that we need to keep working together to increase adoption. In 2007, the adoption rate was about 40%. In 2012, it's about 66%, and that's a remarkable increase, but it appears that it's plateaued. And so I would make a challenge that we all work together to do what we can to increase the broadband adoption in this country so that we don't end up with a failing pocket of society that's not keeping up with the rest of us. And that's the one place I would make a commercial for my company, which is Comcast Internet Essentials. Has a program that's bringing hundreds of thousands of low-income families online, and I would just urge us all to think about what we can do together to improve that. Third, we know that international voices that are shaping internet governance are only going to increase. We were one of the companies, together with Google and Verizon and Intel and AT&T and Cisco, that formed an industry coalition last year, in part with the support of Commissioner McDowell, to try to get a good outcome in the ITU meeting. We learned some key lessons that are important to take into account. One is we know there's a hardcore set of countries that are representing a challenge to internet freedom, but there's a much larger group of countries that recognize the power of the internet for their people and their countries, and they just don't want to be left behind. They don't necessarily trust the United States, but they're not necessarily looking to join the block of countries that are working to control the internet. So we need to show that there are good alternatives to the ITU with multi-sector private associations around the world. There's also been considerable confusion about what is encompassed by internet governance and internet freedom in these international debates. Some think that governance just refers to the ICANN address system, but it's much more than that. And some would restrict the definition of the internet to just the content and the applications providers, but what we need to recognize is it includes ISPs as well. So we need to accept that internet governance encompasses all the elements of the internet and all of the ways that international governments and domestic can regulate the internet. So finally, the one thing we don't know is the future. A decade ago, some people argued that cable would never become an effective competitor to telephone companies and that telephone companies should be under heavy utility regulation. Back then, they didn't mention wireless broadband or the platforms that are being developed by Apple and Google, which now have a rich and integrated suite of content, applications, devices, and networks. They didn't mention these things because we couldn't predict the future. And so the one very important thing we don't know is what the internet's going to look like 10 or even 5 years from now. Through broad, I would say, nonpartisan consensus, we decided a decade ago that the government should be cautious and that business should be bold, and that opened the road to this crazy, fractured, vibrant, messy, experimental internet world that we continue to enjoy. The path we took back then was the right path. It may not be perfect, and it may not always be pretty, but what I learned working on Wall Street, and that applies equally to policymaking, is to ask, is it trending in the right direction? And it is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Well, you were just talking about predictions and uncertainty. Were you here when I was talking to Commissioner Pai?
Yes.
That conversation? And did you get that Yogi Berra quote that I gave him?
I like that. I wrote it down.
Predictions are tough if they involve the future. Okay. So next, Daniel, you're up.
Thanks. 45 minutes is...
And everyone, I assume everyone can hear in the back because no one's raising your hand, but let's make sure we speak up so we're getting all of this recorded.
Fair enough. Yeah, 4 to 5 minutes is not a lot of time, even for someone who talks as fast as I do. I want to spend a little bit of time with my opening remarks drilling down on a bit on the issue of competition in the broadband industry. So this is a topic that Professor Crawford's book has raised, and I think it's a good one, right? Is the telecommunications marketplace, is the broadband marketplace competitive? Professor Crawford thinks that other than Kansas City and within the Fios footprint, the answer is generally no. But as Randy had suggested earlier, I think she probably takes a little bit of an overly narrow market definition. The National Broadband Plan says that the vast majority of us have 2 or more fixed broadband providers. Now, of course, for most of us, 2 or more means 2, right? The cable company and the phone company. And that's reason for some to be a bit concerned, but Fred Kahn, who is the late Dean of Regulated Utilities Law, tells us that it's not clear from an economic perspective whether a 2-player market is one that's going to trend toward cooperation or competition. Right, so the next question then becomes, do we have evidence of competition? And I think I agree with Commissioner Pai that the substantial amounts of capital investment that we've seen evince competition, right? Cable's invested billions to roll out DOCSIS 3.0, and AT&T and Verizon are responding. Greg Sidak has noted that among broadband providers who are reporting churn rates, some of them are showing churn rates that are fairly significant. And so what that shows is that companies are competing. They're competing with capital dollars to try to attract customers, and that customers are responding by actually switching providers. So I think it's a mistake to suggest, to assume, right, that just because we have few players, it means there's no competition. And that is ignoring wireless, right? With LTE, we finally, I think, reaching wireless speeds that might give us a robust third competitor nationwide. So secondly, I want to ask the question, what's the role of the FCC as the regulator of this increasingly dynamic and competitive marketplace? And I think it's a mistake to assume that the agency's role is to manage competition, right, by guiding companies towards some preconceived notion of what the industry should look like and what the optimal level of competition is. And it's because history shows we're notoriously bad at these kinds of predictions. Right, so the 1996 Act was going to break the ILEC monopoly. And the way it was going to do that was by artificially creating intramodal competition from CLECs. Now, there are still a few CLECs hanging around, but it didn't really take off the way that regulators had hoped. And those with longer memories would know that in the 60s and 70s, the Commission saw the need for more competition in broadcasting, and the grand solution was the UHF band, which also never really took off in a big way, despite huge regulatory subsidies. And at this conference last year, Professor Shalansky was talking about the AOL-Time Warner merger, right, where the agency was obsessed with the question of preventing the combined company from having monopoly control of the market for instant messaging, which sounds kind of silly now. Now, of course, we did get telephone and video competition, right? But they came from intermodal sources that the FCC didn't really anticipate. And our biggest successes since 1996 have been the two areas that the Act didn't touch, right? Internet and spectrum. So the corollary to this, I think, is that we have to fight the urge to believe that the way things are is necessarily the way things must be. So there's a cost to regulations that require the homogenization of a product because they eliminate points of potential differentiation and competition among providers. Net neutrality is one good example, right? If all providers have to carry traffic in the same way, then it closes the door to non-net neutral business models, right? Like the low-cost Facebook phones that we're beginning to see emerge in Latin America. And similarly, I think it's a mistake to prohibit tiered pricing and other forms of usage-based broadband pricing. Different pricing structures could allow companies to shift their costs across their customer bases in ways that might be more efficient than the traditional sort of all-you-can-eat unlimited flat rate plan. The reality is, I think, that innovation flourishes with minimal ex-ante regulation because it maximizes the flexibility for competitors to try new business models and differentiate themselves. Fred Kahn understood this, right? He led the deregulation of the airline industry in the Carter administration. And in my notes, I have an exclamation mark after Carter administration. That and allowing the home brewing of beer, I think, were the two greatest things that came out of the Carter years. So what is it that the FCC should be doing if it's not sort of the model that the 1996 Act suggests? I would suggest that it's not a paper tiger. Right? Rather, I think its role should be policing the market to stop specific anti-competitive practices. Right? If an entity has market power and is abusing that market power in a way that causes consumer harm, then by all means the Commission should intervene in order to stop the practice. But my sense is that that type of intervention is probably the exception rather than the rule. And then finally, I think the Commission should also help address market failures, and I'm thinking specifically about USF reforms. I think there's a role for the agency in funding build-outs where it doesn't necessarily make economic sense to build, but I think that is different than providing regular ongoing subsidies of operations the way the high-cost fund has been historically.
Thank you, Daniel. I know Daniel, I think, knows this. I mentioned he's a member of the FSF Board of Academic Advisors, and he mentioned Fred Kahn. And, you know, I'm really proud that Fred Kahn himself was a member of the FSF Board of Academic Advisors, except I haven't been able to take his name down. I've got his years of his life up, but I was always proud that he was as well. And I'll just put in another quick plug for Daniel. I have a paper in my stack of things that he's written on the regulation of VoIP and what some of the specifically what some of the states are doing and how that might impact the future direction of regulation of the internet. And shortly after this conference, we'll be publishing that perspectives from Daniel. So I thank you for that.
Thank you.
Melissa, why don't you go next?
First of all, I'd like to say, Commissioner McDowell, you have been a true statesman at the FCC, and it has been a pleasure for these last 7 years to work with you and your staff. You are going to be missed. So Daniel and I did not coordinate, but you're going to hear a lot of the same themes from what he just said with my remarks. So, you know, I step back and I look at the history of, you know, our regulated utility model. And, you know, for many years, as we all know, both the business environment, monopoly, and the regulatory environment that we operated under were aligned. Along comes the 1996 Act. We move to competition. We make tweaks to the regulatory model, but we don't really change it in big part to accommodate this 1996 Act of competition. And what you have then is, again, what Daniel's talking about in his presentation is writing rules up front, anticipating problems. And I think as we look, you know, forward, especially with the TDM to IP transition, I think we have to turn that on its head. And it's the perfect example of how the construct on how we look at this needs to be changed. We can't write the rules up front. You need to allow, and it's going to be messy, as Rebecca said, but you need to allow the problems to be resolved on a case-by-case basis. And there will be problems. But through the courts, the regulatory agencies, arbitrators, we think that's the best way to approach this brave new world of IP. And over time, the rules of the road will become clear, but in the meantime, regulations will not be holding back accidentally technology or innovation leaps. I also agree with Daniel. There are cases, of course, where network deployment or service availability, for example, with all the universal service reform that we've seen, where there are areas where it is uneconomic or there are issues with serving an area. And that is, of course, the right place and the right time to have rules of the road regulations about funded areas, tailored obligations to meet those needs. So they work hand in hand depending on the situation that you're in. So looking at the TDM to IP transition, we obviously agree the time to look at that transition is now. We do agree, even though not because he's sitting next to me, that the phased approach by AT&T would allow for meaningful market trials and resolve issues, or at least bring up issues, and then try to resolve issues as they arise in a controlled environment. So CenturyLink looks forward to participating in those trials, both as an ILEC and as a customer of TDM and IP services from AT&T and others. We think that is the right way to go here. We at CenturyLink are pursuing our own migration to IP. The dynamics are different for companies. AT&T has one approach. CenturyLink is going to have another approach. We serve a lot of rural America. Those are going to be the most challenged areas, like they always are, to get, you know, IP and how you move, when you move, what you do. But again, this is the time to start that conversation now and to work with carriers like AT&T and others to see the best way to do it. And notice I'm not talking about setting right now the rules of the road for regulation. You can't do that. When we look at the TDM to IP transition, we think the FCC and the industry should be guided by a few principles, which I'll just go through. First, the FCC should refrain from applying any new regulatory obligations on IP-based services that are not narrowly tailored to address a specific problem. Second, the FCC should refrain from applying any regulation found to be unnecessary and counterproductive. And third, and this is important again to CenturyLink and other carriers, especially in rural areas, you need to have some flexible guidelines here for the transition to IP, one-size-fits-all standards, and deadlines is not going to work for all the companies moving to IP in this country. Each carrier does face unique circumstances and challenges as it migrates over. In other areas, as I mentioned, you know, this all works where effective competition exists, and I think in this situation it does. In other areas, that may not be the case. For universal service reform, we've been very supportive of it. We do think there are areas that do need help with the government with funding, and obviously comes that with tailored obligations, but putting that aside for going forward as we start on this new journey on IP, we think that the approach AT&T took was the right measured one for now.
Melissa, I'm going to just wrap up in just the next minute.
And I am done. No.
Okay, well, that was kind of a segue to our next speaker, Bob.
I'll just tell you, in all my years of doing panels, I have never gone long. Never.
No, you did fine. And actually, as I said earlier, Melissa just found out 2 days ago that she was going to substitute. And I appreciate that very much when Steve Davis had a problem. So thanks again for that. Bob, why don't you just take 4 or 5 minutes, and I'm going to do the same thing with you, and then we're going to go to questions. So you got four
Yeah, and I'll try to be quick. I can probably make some of these points in response to your questions. Thank you for having us here today, and I echo Melissa's comments about Commissioner McDowell as well. I think he's going to be greatly missed at that agency, and I hope whoever it is that they choose to replace you carries on the standard that you really set forth, because I think you are a really important voice in this debate, and that voice is going to be greatly needed in the future. I think, Randy, the title of today's event, I think, is the right title. It's completing the transition to a digital world. And from our perspective, you couldn't have a more accurate assessment of where the market is today. And in the recent comments that we filed on our IP transition petition, we pointed out that the percentage, and I'm going to focus on wireline, not wireless, because the IP transition petition is really about the wireline infrastructure we have at the agency. That's not to leave alone the wireless side where a huge transformation is going on. But on the wireless network, or excuse me, on the wireline network, in our region and our footprint, the states that we do business in, and it's beyond our footprint because it's the entire state. When we look at what the state of the IP transformation is, across our entire 22 states that we do business in, only 25% of the housing units in those states are connected to the old POTS infrastructure today. And the numbers, when you break down the individual states, and this is an appendix to the filing that we did, are really striking. In Michigan, only 6% of the housing units in Michigan are currently connected to the old POTS infrastructure. In Nevada, it's 18%. In a state like Florida, it's 19%. So this transformation is not only underway, it's almost done. And what we are going to deal with over the course of the next 10 years is dealing with the last adopters to make sure that no one gets left behind in this transition, and the regulators, because the regulators are standing in the way of allowing carriers to make this transition in large part. And it's because they have a lot of very thorny issues that have to be addressed in order for us to be able to complete the transition. And it's because of that we asked for a proceeding at the Commission to kind of oversee this transition of the last adopters and the regulatory structure that applies to the old POTS network. In the filing, I think we asked for two basic things. I think we asked, is it better for the FCC, which has a myriad of these issues, a couple dozen issues teed up in a couple of dozen different dockets, to address all of the issues implicated by this transition in 21 or 22 unconnected proceedings? Or is it better to look at these issues comprehensively in a limited geographic area and conduct an experiment? The second question we asked is the FCC the right place to do this? And I think that in the filing, we think the answer to both of those questions is yes. We think it's very important to do this in a way that's both efficient from a technology perspective as well as efficient from a consumer perspective, because we don't want to leave anybody behind in this transition. We don't have all the answers to the questions, and I'm going to tell you from our perspective, from a technology perspective within our company, this is a huge undertaking. We have a big team that is looking at how we're going to accomplish this, and making this shift from the TDM technology and architecture we use over to all IP is a massive undertaking. And there's policy issues that are going to be implicated, and we don't even know what all the questions are, let alone what all the answers are. That's why we thought doing this in a comprehensive proceeding at the FCC made sense. I'm going to make 3 points about what I think the FCC in conducting this proceeding really needs to do.
Okay, now do it fairly briefly and we'll come.
Very quick. One, they got to let people retire old technology. This is not something that has never happened before. We did it with the internet backbone when we made a shift from OC 192s to OC 768 backbones. We did it with digital TV, and we did it with the analog wireless networks. Two, when we're looking at the new regulatory structures, we have to be looking at these services at the service level. A lot of the distinctions the FCC wants to make today are to apply regulations at the service level, but only to companies that have infrastructure. That's not a valid way to do that. And I think we have to be very limited about the areas in which we're going to put regulations on these new services. Public safety, 911. You know, does that mean that we have to have a 911 requirement on the Xbox voice service for people to communicate while gaming? No. But we have to figure out where those lines are and what services are going to be important, what real-time communication services are going to be important to put very minimal regulation, narrowly tailored, as Melissa put it, to accomplish the purpose that we're trying to achieve. And three, overriding all of this, all of the policies that are adopted at the Commission, adopted by policymakers, should be designed to incent investment in infrastructure. And that should be the first and foremost question that gets asked: what is going to be the impact of what we do on the incentives of companies to invest in infrastructure in this country, excuse me. And with that, I'll wrap it up because I know we're going to get to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob, and all the panelists. And again, you people in the audience, you can think of questions as well, and we're going to get to a couple of those questions. And I know there's some people that have come in late. I know there's some of you that I've discovered just don't read all of your emails. I want to make sure you know Senator Rubio is speaking now at just about around 1 o'clock, and I did have a chance to look at his the draft of his speech, and I can say this: it's very quite detailed in laying out his telecommunications priorities. So, you know, I think we're in for a real treat. Commissioner McDowell, now that you can speak freely, or almost freely, and I want to ask you this, just following up on Bob Quinn and Melissa Newman, because the reality is you're not going to really be making these decisions. Now, when you look at this IP transition and AT&T's petition, what you've heard here and what you know about, what are the real concerns that you have really, and what advice can you give to the Commission about how to approach this thing from your own perspective?
Well, first of all, thank you again for having me. By the way, congratulations to FSF. The new venue here, showing that you need more space, and it won't be long, I think, before you have these things at the Verizon Center. So, so congratulations, Randy, and all the success to FSF.
Thank you.
So I think there's some excellent questions raised. Some of these issues actually have been lurking for years and years, and but we have hit a point, I think, in the market to where we need to rethink it. I think the Commission has a lot of statutory authority to actually act here, so I agree with what Bob said in terms of that this is a good forum. I do think Congress needs to step up and really, as quickly as possible, look at a fundamental rewrite. Randy, I mean, you're really the father of DACA, Digital Age Communications Act, so you know that you foresaw this coming. How many years ago was that?
That was 2005, so it's about time now.
Yeah.
We're getting close.
So a lot of these ideas regarding the IP transition, or whatever, it's all about what you were envisioning back then. I think it's important, as I see Bob Quinn, I saw Jonathan Lee, I saw Carol Wilner earlier, and I was having a little bit of a flashback here, especially given the announcement of yesterday. I think regulators and policymakers need to be patient and wait to see what markets can do. If I think about back to 10 years ago, right exactly now, that was in the throes of the debate over the unbundled network element platform, UNEP as we called it. That was all about trying to bring residential voice competition through wireline services. The best and the brightest on both sides of that debate did not foresee the rise of, first of all, cable telephony, or the rise of wireless as a substitute. That was laughed at, that whole concept that wireless, the quality of it wasn't any good, your calls get dropped, people aren't going to, there's not enough build out in residential areas, not good enough reception, people are never going to substitute, wireline for wireless, or have your wireless as a substitute for wireline. And now we have more than a third of all U.S. households are wireless only. And that's evidenced by a lot of what's pointed out in AT&T's petition. Is all the rise of that competition. But nobody 10 years ago saw that happening. And so I think if you're patient as a regulator, as a member of Congress, the markets will work around. There were some other comments regarding broadband competition. Consumers are telling us that wireless broadband is a substitute, not in every case, not for every market, but is a substitute. It is the fastest growing segment of the broadband market is wireless. And with the vast majority of American consumers having a choice of at least 4 wireless broadband providers, and that number will increase. And as we see the build out of AT&T continue to, of LTE continue, AT&T's LTE as well, but of LTE continue to spike, that'll be game changing as well as we get broadband in the car, things like that. So we don't know what's coming over the horizon, and the last thing we want to have is the government to somehow preempt or nip in the bud innovation that's coming over the horizon. So the concerns I would have is certainly want to make sure that consumers aren't cut off. We have a plethora of devices of wireless and wireline devices in the McDowell household, one of which is a twisted copper pair Verizon line that comes in with the phone number I've had my entire life, literally, because I live in what's left of the farm where I grew up. So we've kept that wireline phone, in part as an experiment to see how long is it going to last. But for those who depend on that and that's all they have, you don't want to cut them off. But we do want to nudge them. As Bob pointed out, there's precedent for this. It is a good thing. Let's talk about analog sunset in cellular, for instance. That was overdue to have happened, but I was proud to have been part of the vote that finally got rid of analog cellular. So let's be patient and let's be optimistic, and let's not try to think that we're smarter than markets.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. I want to ask Rebecca this question. Earlier, during my conversation with Commissioner Pai, I asked him whether he had read Susan Crawford's book, and he said no. But I know that I bet you $100 that you've read Susan Crawford's book, and okay, well, this will be on page 74, I think. But here's what I want to ask you, because this has a lot of appeal to a lot of people. She forced me to think about these issues, and she basically says cable has really won the battle. So I'm going to give you a chance right now here today to say that you've won the broadband battle, and then maybe Mr. Quinn will disagree. But she says cable has won the battle because with your technology, you can really offer the very high-speed service, 100 gigabits or more, and therefore you dominate and control the market, and that wireless broadband is not a competitor, and that Comcast should be regulated like an electric utility, and that's basically what the book says if you didn't get all the way to the end. Now, you can only have about a couple minutes to respond, but tell me what your response is to her thesis.
Well, so I'd like to say we won the battle because when Verizon introduced service that was 300 megabits per second, we went to 305. So we're continuing to outflank each other. So I think on the issue of market definition, how you define the market, which is a huge part of this conversation. I think on wireless, the answer is simple, which is that it's complicated. And I have always liked the Obama DOJ submission to the National Broadband Plan, which is now a few years old, but I thought they got it right. DOJ got it right then, which is clearly this is a trend that's going to increase competition. Exactly how it's going to unfold, exactly for whom it's going to be a substitute, and what subsegments it's going to be something that's ancillary, we don't know. But as Commissioner McDowell said, as anybody who's awake, I think would know that wireless is going to be, is already and is going to be a huge force. We do need to get more spectrum out. That's for sure, for wireless to be able to continue to grow. But you know, the government's doing what they can on that. In terms of the very high speed, the definition of high speed networks, in that you have to be at 1 gigabit or 100 megabits per second to count as broadband, I don't think any serious academic or business person or economist or engineer would subscribe to that. I think that what people will, I think, mostly take into account is just looking at our industry at cable. About 10 years ago, I think it was, our speed was 1.5 megabits per second. It went up to, I think, 16. I should refer to, I saw Michael Powell come in, who will probably know these off the top of his head, but it went up to 16 megabits per second in 2007. And then with DOCSIS 3 rolling out, went up to 50, and now we're up to 300. Just this week, we doubled our speeds in many of our markets at the most popular tiers without imposing any cost. So I think the notion of that being an ossified market that isn't making any changes, that needs to be regulated like a public utility, I don't frankly think it's a serious proposal. I think it's probably meant to be a more provocative one. And I think to make the point that Commissioner McDowell made, look at the investment. And during the recession, when most parts of the U.S.-based industry were not investing, 3 of the top 10 companies that were investing during the recession were 3 of the broadband providers.
Okay. Well, you know, when you referred to you only have to be awake to know so-and-so, then that made me think again about that Yogi Berra quote that Commissioner Pye and I exchanged, but this one was, you can observe a lot just by watching. I think that when Commissioner McDowell leaves, he ought to endow a sign that they put up on the commission entrance. You can observe a lot just by watching. Because that happens in markets. Now, for Bob Quinn, I want to ask you this, and then we're going to turn to some audience questions before we wrap up. Your IP transition petition proposal, which in my earlier conversation with Commissioner McDowell, I commended, and the fact that commissions put it on, on the docket, opened up a docket, and you explained, in your view, the importance of it, and what it's intended to do. But you didn't talk as much, as I wouldn't expect you to, about some of the concerns that have been raised about it, at least that I've picked up in reading the press or the papers. So one of them, that seems to come through really is the notion that the competitors are raising, that when we move to this new world, that they should have wholesale access on a wholesale basis, or wholesale access to your fiber. And I think I've seen that. When I hear that, it just, boy, it brings me back to, the uni issue, the unbundling issue, and before that, open network architecture. And, I could go further back if I had to, but that has a certain appeal because you guys are big. I mean, you're a big corporation. Comcast is pretty big too. So what's the answer to the suggestion that in this all IP world, you should not have to unbundle and offer your fiber on a wholesale basis?
Thank you. I'm going to make an observation.
You really mean that? Thank you.
I do. Okay. But I was really relieved when Ajit finally got the message and kind of did the generational dumbing down and started referring to movies like with Cool Hand Luke, because I was worried about you when he made a couple of movie references and you had to say, I didn't know what he was talking about.
Me either.
You know, the wholesale issue, I think, is a very interesting. It's a very interesting issue. It's the reason that the competitive community has unanimously occurred that we should not do anything at all to finish or complete the IP transition, and we shouldn't open up a docket. And I'm going to make one correction of you. The FCC has not opened up a proceeding in response to my petition, the 6-month anniversary of which is coming up on May the 7th, by the way. They have started a task force, but they have not opened up a proceeding yet.
All right. Well, as you and I know, 6 months anniversaries at the commission are really, you wouldn't say that anything's been unduly delayed at that point or that they're behind schedule. But go ahead.
So the wholesale question is an interesting one because I always, when I talk about Ethernet services, I like to think about, you know, what Sprint says at the FCC versus what Sprint does in the marketplace. And they made a fundamental decision. For a long time, Sprint would walk into the FCC and claim that for their WiMAX network and for their wireless broadband network, T1s were a completely sufficient backhaul alternative for them, and that they could not foresee the day when they would need anything more than T1 backhaul. Nobody believed that at the time. You can't certainly deploy LTE or any kind of 4G technology with TDM-based T1 backhaul. But they did an RFP, so they kind of came to their senses, and they did an RFP, and they said, we've got a nationwide network of cell towers, and we're going to do an RFP so that we can get to 1 gig, 100 megabit per second Ethernet backhaul for our entire cell towers. And these are cell towers in rural areas and urban areas. They did 2 phases of the RFP that they did. They were wildly successful. They ended up with 20, they split the business up amongst 25 or 30 providers in a highly competitive bid situation. I think Verizon did, I see Tom in the audience, Verizon did a filing at the commission, and I want to get the number right, but I'm going to have to guess. I believe they said they got less than 20% of the bid in their own footprint. And I think that tells you that in a competitive market like this, the market is highly competitive. If you want to build fiber, you will have a plethora of companies that are willing to build that for you. You'll be able to choose amongst dozens of bids, and you'll get a market-based rate. And the problem with going back to a world where we're now going to regulate that market is what the CLECs really want is they want a differential between what is achievable in the market and something that is less than that they will be allowed to make a profit off of because they don't want to build that infrastructure themselves. And I think that takes us directly back to all the TELRIC wars and below-cost pricing, and I think it's going to have a huge disincentive for any infrastructure investment in this country. And you remember my third point was we got to understand what the policies are going to do. And when you start enabling, for example, below-cost access to fiber, forcing somebody to deploy fiber, you're going to end up right where Europe is today. And Europe is trying to walk back from those policies because they don't have the fiber infrastructure that's been built in the United States of America. And I think it's wrong-headed. I'm not afraid of that discussion. I think that we adopted the Telecom Act in 1996, and at the end of the day, we have to figure out how we're going to make the transition from that copper TDM regulated world to fiber. And I don't think simply going back to re-regulating all that stuff is the way to make that happen.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for that. Now, I'm going to ask this one more question. I want to ask a question to Melissa, and then I'm going to recognize a couple from the audience, and then we're going to then we'll have to wrap it up. But it seems to me that the other concern that I've heard about the transition plan, and I'm trying to be more specific here, or people that this concern has come from, or at least to some extent, are state public utility commissions who I think have potentially expressed some concerns about it, but at least when I think about it, it does raise in my mind as we move to the IP world, really, what the, Susan Crawford wants Comcast to be regulated as an electric utility, but they've got plenty of electric utilities they can still regulate, I think, anyway, and water utilities and others. But Melissa, just address, if you would, what you envision the State Utility Commission role to be really in an IP world, if you can do that fairly briefly.
Well, first of all, I do think there's a role for the state commissions, and I certainly think from consumers, they're the closest on the ground to what's going on in the states. And especially with respect, in my case, my company, with rural areas and how that transition goes and what's going on in the states, I think there is a role for them from a consumer protection standpoint, from understanding how different areas in the states will fare. I think some of that has to be worked out. I'm not sure I have, the best answer for that, but I have always felt that the states have an on-the-ground know-how of what's going on that's very hard to, manage, from the federal level at the FCC. And I think working in partnership with the companies moving to the transition, with the FCC as we think about this, I think those roles can be figured out. But I do not want to discount the states because they know what's going on and where, what customers, what they're hearing from customers, more so I think sometimes than the FCC can. And I think there is a role there. But I'm not sure, I'll be honest, and this goes to, figuring out things ahead of time. I'm not sure I yet know what that is.
Okay. Now, does anyone on this panel, just because I've been thinking about that question a lot about the state utilities, having watched them for a long time and knowing what they do, but it does seem to me like their role, to me, is fundamentally changing. Any other quick comments anyone has about the state utilities? Daniel?
I think the wireless model offers a very good model for the division between federal and state authority going forward. When you ask sort of what issues should be done at the federal level, what issues should be done at the state level, at a very high level, right, the issue is the benefit that you get of local knowledge that state regulators have, that the FCC generally doesn't have the ability or the inclination to pursue, versus the spillover effects that happen when a state regulator enacts restrictions that affect customers beyond their borders, right? So when the states start regulating a national enterprise, it has effects not only on the state regulator's constituency, but those outside their borders as well.
Okay. Now I'm going to take maybe one or two questions, and there's going to be a premium on asking a question briefly. Does anyone have a question? Paul, the mic is coming. Just identify yourself if you would.
Hi, Paul Barbagallo, reporter with Bloomberg BNA. So, Randy, as a follow-up to your question, should states maintain some type of regulatory authority over interconnection? And what should that regulatory regime look like?
Is there a particular person you want to? You weren't addressing that to me, I'm sure. So, okay. Well, we'll let one or two people. Maybe we should let Bob really answer that first.
I don't believe that 251 style regulation over IP interconnection, which is, IP to IP interconnection for real-time communications is really kind of just emerging. We have in place a huge structure of 251 TDM interconnections in place. We know that in the IP world, we have peering that's in place that impacts networks across the world. We were able to interconnect the entire worldwide internet on an IP basis with no regulatory intervention from the states, from the federal governments, or from any of the governments across the entire world. real-time IP to IP interconnection is something that is just now emerging. The requests are to try and figure out how we're going to interact and how we're going to exchange traffic of real-time communications that's going to have to be managed. I think that's just developing, and I'd go back, harken back to something that Commissioner McDowell said about let's have some patience and let's see how this develops, not in an individual state, because that's not how people communicate anymore. In an efficient IP world, I envision in the United States a limited number of points of interconnection. I don't envision carriers having to interconnect in every city and every state. In an IP world, if we're managing the traffic, we can do that at a lot lower cost and a lot more efficiency. And I think bringing the states and the municipalities back into the game makes it like we have to have that interconnection here. And I think we have a lot of experience in the IP to IP world that the markets and the networks figured it out very efficiently, and I think we need to have some patience, and let's see how this develops as well.
Okay, Bob, Rob has a quick comment, and then we're going to try and take one more
Just
question.
to build on that very quickly, and that was a very thorough answer, this is where the idea of test beds actually could be very useful. You know, with a controlled environment, with the parameters premised on consumer protection, but let's answer some of these questions in the real world with a variety of test beds under different circumstances, different geographic locations, different state of competition, and all the rest. And let's find out, let's get on with that. That's something that could be very, very useful. And I don't understand the vehement opposition to that kind of way of approaching things when you would premise it on consumer protection. It's a test.
Okay, and Rebecca has a quick comment as well.
Just to amplify the amplification, I think that going back to what was the Yogi Berra thing about watching?
You can observe a lot just by watching.
Yeah, and so, you know, we've had how many decades of traffic exchange over the internet that has worked just magically well, I would say. And so I think we need to be very practical and grounded in what's actually worked in the real world, and I think to muck that up would be a shame.
Okay, does anyone remember the original Yogi Berra quote that Commissioner Pai used that's relevant to a lot of things we talk about with the Commission? Anyone remember? If you come to a fork in the road, take it. That has to be done sometimes. Okay, do we have one further question? I'm going to give that to my friend Lynn Stanton, please.
Hi, Lynn Stanton, TR Daily.
Nice and loud.
Louder than this? This is a follow-up on Paul's question. You spoke of IP interconnection, but what about, are you envisioning that no one will have, or will not necessarily have, the kind of voice service the cable companies now offer, you know, where you're packaging voice with data? They're just going to have data services, and they're going to have to go out and get their own Skype or whatever to package on top of that, rather than the telco providing something that looks to the consumers like what they have now, where they just pick up the phone and make a call, rather than, you know, having a camera on their computer or whatever. And how would that interconnection just work?
So, you know, so Skype's a good example, right? Skype, I can't remember what their last number was. I think they have 250 million different VoIP accounts. So, you know, to be very clear, Commissioner Pai earlier was referencing the number of VoIP subscribers in the United States. That's a subset of the VoIP community. What they're talking, I think the numbers that he was quoting from are from the FCC report, which requires interconnected VoIP providers and companies like the cable companies to report on their VoIP subscriptions. It doesn't count Skype at all, which I think has about 250 million different customers across the world. And you can do a Skype call, and it flows through the regular best efforts network and gets terminated today with no problem at all anywhere in the world. My kids use Skype religiously, despite the fact that I work for a phone company, a communications company. I envision that what we're hearing from people is they want a different kind of interconnection than the Skype the Skype version, which is just best efforts internet. And remember, all of these broadband companies are all interconnected. I mean, you can connect and communicate with a broadband company, so if there's a Skype subscriber on the other side of the world, the best efforts internet's going to get those packets to where they need to go. I hear that there's a demand for something different than that in real-time communications. It's whether it's Dan Berniger talking about HD voice. People want something more in a managed service, and I think we're just now starting to try and figure out what does that product look like? Where do we interconnect? Are we going to manage it on both sides so that we're going to prioritize the traffic so that we can deliver a high-quality service? That's different than the Skype over-the-top model, but my view is it's going to be eminently the same kind of thing. It's just going to be at a higher quality. And if there are companies that are infrastructure companies that are hosting VoIP providers, that's going to be a service that they're going to say, hey, instead of best efforts, why don't you sign up with me and I will manage your VoIP product and I'll do the interconnection agreements and we'll have a higher quality voice product in the marketplace.
Okay,
I think that's
Bob.
really going to work if you let it.
Okay, well, signing up with you is a good place probably to stop, and all of these people signing up with them. Now, here's what we're going to do. As soon as we finish here, I'm going to ask my good friend and colleague here at FSF and former Commissioner Debbie Tate to come up and get the video panel started. I want to thank her, of course, for moderating this and appreciate it. And Senator Rubio is going to speak again right at 1 o'clock, so we're going to have to stay on a schedule. We're going to have a really nice lunch for you guys in between. So now, here's what I want to do. Commissioner McDowell has been very kind to speak at many Free State Foundation events, and earlier I had a chance here to thank him for his service again. But what I wanted, and I hope you'll come back once you don't have your exalted position and participate some more as well. Well, I might. But I want to just one more time, let's all thank him for his service separately. And now, if you'll just join with me in thanking our panel for that great panel, I'd appreciate it as well.